one of Richard Nixon's most trusted aides and the first of the Nixon aides to go on trial for Watergate. On the 50th anniversary of the historic Nixon trips to China and Russia, 2 weeks that changed the world, Dwight Chapin shares his untold story and unveils his take on the real Richard Nixon in what is, according to Nixon tapes historian Luke Nichter, likely the last Nixon memoir to be written by someone with close personal contact with the president himself. All of this on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Dwight Chapin served as deputy assistant to Richard Nixon with responsibility for the planning and execution of the president's schedule and appearances. He served as the acting chief of protocol for the president's 1972 historic trip to China, clandestinely setting it up with Henry Kissinger. And his first book, The President's Man, The Memoirs of Nixon's Trusted Aide. And with that, welcome, Dwight.
Hi, good morning. Thanks, Jim.
Nice to have him. And we are in studio, and Dwight, by coincidence, lives in Greenwich, as well as I do. As Luke said, you've been silent since Watergate. Why now?
Why now? Well, I was involved with putting together the renovation of the Nixon Library out in California, and as I did that, I really realized how little people knew about Richard Nixon. I mean, they either knew he went to China or Watergate, but the man had this huge spectrum of things that he had accomplished in his life. I mean, he had been in public service for decades, and so I thought, I knew him pretty well. And I'm one of the few that are still around that can get this down for the record. So I did it for historical purposes.
Now, this is one thing that really surprised me. And, of course, I see you as the Watergate guys. We know all the names in there, and that you got nailed in it. What I didn't know is you knew nothing about Watergate. All that they got you on was that they said you lied to the grand jury.
Yes.
Which just blew me away. Go ahead.
Yes. Well, what happened was Don Segretti, who I hired to pull pranks on the Democrats, this would be a prank so that one Democrat would think another Democrat had pulled the prank and not a Republican.
It wasn't meant to be illegal.
It was not. There was not to be nothing illegal about it. In fact, when I hired Don Segretti to do this, I said, one of the reasons I'm hiring you is you're a lawyer and you'll know what's right and what's wrong. When Don testified to the grand jury, he said, Dwight told me that he was hiring me because I was a lawyer. The minute he did that, they could not prosecute me for anything that he did. I mean, by his own admission. But they basically created a trap for me, took me into a grand jury room and asked me a series of questions. And I responded either not to the best of my recollection or not that I recall. They didn't then prompt me with some piece of paper or some evidence. They went on to the next subject. And so I got myself tripped up by my own words.
But you were not lying overtly in your own mind.
I had, in my heart of hearts, I've gone through this so many times. There was no intention on my part to lie. And then back to your main point, I never appeared before the big Watergate grand jury. This was only kind of like a sub-grand jury where they were looking at the dirty tricks.
Interesting. Give us a little bit on the role of John Dean, because there's also you also kind of elucidate on things that aren't really known about John Dean, and also in part that you were kind of set up to be a fall guy.
Well, John Dean is at the heart of this whole situation. John Dean is the person that took G. Gordon Liddy, who ended up being in charge of the break-ins and so forth. He took him to meet Attorney General John Mitchell. The first meeting that Mitchell had with Liddy was arranged by John Dean. At the end of that meeting, John Dean told Liddy to go prepare a intelligence plan. So it was Dean who gave the instructions to Liddy to put together the plan that led to the break-in. So when the break-in happens, John Dean doesn't go forth and tell his immediate boss, Bob Haldeman, or the former general counsel for the president, John Ehrlichman, or the president himself. He doesn't tell them the truth. He starts covering it up. So from the very outset, Dean is covering this matter up. And for 9 months, he does not tell Nixon the truth. Now, we have documented in the book exactly how this unfolded, because what do we have? We have the gift of the tapes.
Mm-hmm.
And whereas the tapes, you can say, did Mr. Nixon in?
Yeah.
On the other hand, now it's giving us a snapshot of the truth because we see exactly what the conversations were. And Jim, I want to make this point. In the back of the book, we have the appendix, and we've arranged for a reader to read the transcript of various little segments of Nixon talking with Dean, and then we have a reference number there. You can go on the internet and hear that at the same time.
And I did not know that Dean had the responsibility for the intelligence plan. That kind of surprised me too. Let's briefly talk about, because I couldn't stand Nixon. Obviously, I was a toughs then, and every night John Chancellor would come on and say, "In another unbelievable,"
right.
We were laughing at that.
Yeah.
But I looking back, the man was a strategic presidency. I mean, and he would be almost a liberal Democrat today. China, EPA, busing integration, healthcare, colas. Did you see him as a strategic president then? And did he want to be Disraeli or something? What did he see himself as?
On his tombstone, it says the word peacemaker.
Yeah.
And I think that when you really get down to it, that he, in the foreign affairs area in particular, he saw himself as a statesman and as a person working to achieve peace. Nixon was a Quaker.
Yeah.
He didn't believe in war. He wanted to end the Vietnam War. He did end the Vietnam War. But in his heart of hearts, peacemaker, I think, would be the answer to that question.
Okay. So since you were so close for so long, what don't we know about this guy who was a real enigma?
Yes. The public does not know a
Yes.
great deal about him because the emphasis of the media has been on Nixon's, quote, evilness, or Watergate, or in many cases China. So there's kind of this one-dimensional look at Richard Nixon. He was a human being. He put his pants on one leg at a time. Yeah. You know, I mean, but he was a man with a tremendous amount of heart. I mean, he had great empathy for people.
But you thought he had to hide, though.
Well, he just didn't. He was not the kind of man that wore it on his shirt sleeve, nor did he have high regard for people who did. So you're right. It's kind of a contradiction there. H.R.
Haldeman, who you were very close to. In fact, I was surprised that you guys had enough, back and forth. The balance between, it was the German Praetorian Guards, Ehrlichman and Haldeman, blocked anybody from getting to Nixon, versus what I think it always was he set up a system that Nixon wanted.
Right.
But did it end up disservicing Nixon by isolating him too much?
Well, it ended up misserving Nixon to the extent that the concept of there being a Berlin Wall, what happened is the media used the Ehrlichman, Haldeman names and so forth to connotate kind of this Berlin Wall, and it was very unfair. We ran the office of the president the way the president wanted it run.
Yes.
And the criticism that Bob Haldeman gets for how tightly organized it was not for what Bob Haldeman wanted. It was for what Nixon was demanding and needed. Nixon had watched a very efficient Eisenhower administration.
Yeah.
He was vice president. And General Eisenhower had brought in General Andrew Goodpasture to set up the system. Goodpasture had worked for Eisenhower over at NATO, and so Goodpasture and Eisenhower had this system, and Nixon knew about it, and he arranged at the very outset of his administration for Goodpasture to come in and meet with Haldeman, and that's how the system really got built and put in place. And it had a tremendous amount of discipline to it. Yes. So if somebody wanted to come in and see the president, they had to have a damn good reason for why they were coming in, and Nixon needed to know before the guy walked in the door what it was they were expecting him to agree to or approve or lobby for. And so you had cabinet officers who were told put this down on paper before you come in. And these are guys that had run companies and been governors of states and so forth, and they weren't used to being told you have to put something down in black and white ahead of time. So there was a lot of scuttlebutt and upsetness about how the process worked.
And I will say this, Haldeman was very objective about it. Chris Whipple, who's a friend of our show, wrote the book on Chief of Staffs.
Yes.
And that the Chief of Staff is key to the success of a presidency, and that Bob Haldeman set up the modern presidential structure. But it wasn't followed during Watergate.
Watergate was this abnormal situation that got into it. And here's the difference, Jim. Watergate was not a managerial activity. It was a political activity, and it needed the political part of the equation more than a managerial part. Haldeman managed it for containment. It didn't need containment, it needed exposure. And had the exposure part taken place, we wouldn't have ended up in the mess that they ended up in.
All right, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll be back with Dwight Chapin in our next segment, and we'll talk about Nixon going to China and other things. That was great. We're back with Dwight Chapin, who was, in a sense, Nixon's body man for a while. Before we move on, I want to ask you a question that Luke Nichter suggested that I go about. Talking about the Nixon taping system, he said there were those like Ray Price, who was the chief speechwriter, who downplayed their existence, said that Nixon's entitled to do that, and that Henry Kissinger and John Ehrlichman felt totally betrayed, and then there were others who said he should have destroyed it. What do you think on that, and what have you learned from the taping system? You partly talked about Dean's role, but go ahead.
Well, I think you might be able to measure how various people felt about the taping system after it was exposed by what their liabilities may be. Dr. Kissinger, who I happen to admire greatly, or John Ehrlichman, who I also admire, may have said things in there that they had wished were not taped, whereas Ray Price, who was one of the great guys of all time, had nothing to fear. He just sat there and talked to Nixon about speeches, not about policy issues to the degree that the others would. My feeling is that the president intended to use that material in order to have accuracy in his books or papers or whatever he'd work on in the future. And I think he completely forgot that it was things were being taped. I mean, it was not like this was top of mind awareness with him, or he would have had it yanked out early on.
What would you have advised him to do? Obviously, you didn't know about it.
I was of the John Conley school of thought, which was the minute the tapes were exposed, they should have been destroyed instantly before anybody could put any warrants or anything else on it, just because. But that, I got to say there, Jim, that's from retrospect. So there are very positive things coming out on the tapes now. Keep in mind that the tapes that we know about and that you've heard about are small. Only 2% or 7%.
Yeah, we've had Luke on, and he's been very interesting about that.
Yes.
I've always said Dr. Kissinger wouldn't want to hear himself because I'm sure he was in this, you're the most brilliant man, and, all this stuff, kissing up to Nixon, know, and then going out to. One more on Watergate. What the heck was it? What was Watergate? Why did it happen? Why are they bugging the Democratic headquarters, which made,
Yes.
What is Watergate? Do we know yet?
President Nixon made the same point. He said, why in the world would anybody bug the Democratic National Committee? Anybody with any common sense would bug the campaign office of like McGovern or Muskie or something. So what we know is these were, as Nixon says, misguided people within the campaign that thought that they were going to, provide in information that would be intriguing to Nixon and to Haldeman. So I mean, the ultimate thing here is that the guys that were working thought that the information that they would get would be of interest to their superiors. And, of course, they're trying to impress their superiors, particularly John Dean.
Interesting. All right, let's go through some stuff. You were there for the 1962 You Won't Have Nixon to Kick Around Anymore. I get a sense you thought that was a really pivotal moment.
Yes, I think when Nixon came down, he had run against Jack Kennedy. He came back to California. He ran for governor of California in 1962.
Right.
And I was a senior at USC then, but I was a Nixon field man. That was my first Nixon campaign. I happened to be in the hall the morning he came down after that election and lost, and he walked into the ballroom there at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, and I was standing like 12 feet from him when he said, "Gentlemen, you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. This is my last press conference." My feeling is that you were seeing Nixon as raw as he could possibly have been, with all of the resentments of what he had done,
and self-pitying too.
Well, but he had been attacked by the media for years, and all through the Eisenhower years. Keep in mind, Nixon carried all the political baggage for that administration. Eisenhower didn't. It was Nixon that was. The Herb Block cartoons weren't about weren't about Ike. They were about Nixon.
All right, peace with honor. You mentioned before you wanted to end the Vietnam War. I was bothered by two things. One, the secret peace plan in the campaign, which never seemed to really be anything. And B, was it peace with honor, or was it dragging it on because he didn't want the political ramifications of losing Vietnam, which meant a lot of people died who didn't need to die? Where do you come on down on that?
First of all, Nixon wanted to end the war. He never, ever said he had a secret plan for ending the war. That has been disproven. It came from a reporter who wrote a piece of copy at the start of the New Hampshire primary campaign, and that has been taken apart several different times. It just did not. He did not say that. Number one. Number two, he wanted to end the war. I think it is outrageous to imply that he wanted this thing to continue, to have young men being killed, and on his conscience, he wanted to end that war. When he took office, there were 550,000 troops there.
That Johnson had put
Yes, he's not the one that built it up. He's the one that brought it down. When he resigned, there were 5,000 left, from 550,000 down to 5,000, and the war ended shortly thereafter at the start of the Jerry Ford administration.
Yeah. See, at the end of that, too, there was this Kissinger comment, or I don't know if it was public, a decent interval, we know it's going to fall, right? Which is what happened. And see, so it always looks like it was a political thing. And I'm glad to hear that you're saying that morally Nixon, didn't drag it on for his ego or for that kind of thing.
Right, but if you talk to people that were protesting or from the left or so forth, he didn't do it fast enough. He didn't do it, but they're not the ones having to deal with it. They're clueless as to what was going on.
All right, the week that changed the world. Tell us the story. Because you were right there on the inside, which I hadn't known. And I can tell you, from when I was at Tufts, my roommate went over to China after you guys had done all that, and he said it was still so shocking that Chinese people just stopped and looked at him.
When we first went to China, I went with Dr. Kissinger had his secret trip in July, and then he went back in October, and I was on that trip when he went back in October, and then I went with General Haig in January of 72, and then with Nixon in February of 72. And it was like stepping back into ancient times. I mean, it was muted grays and muted blues and colorless. And, there were signs up, the running dogs of capitalism. I mean, all of this anti-American propaganda and so forth. And so it's nothing like the images we get of China today and the progression that they've made, which was significant. This was a kingdom that was very mysterious, and it was back there in time. And what Nixon did was, by making that journey, he opened the doors.
And, he started what I call Nixon in China, where the least likely person makes a move like that.
Yes.
Quickly, Mao and Zhou Enlai. What did you think of them? I mean, you obviously were exposed to them, right?
Well, I was not exposed to Mao. The only people that went with Nixon to meet Mao was Winston Lord, who later became an ambassador, and he was an assistant to Henry Kissinger. Henry obviously went. So it was Nixon, Kissinger, and Winston Lord, and Bob Taylor, who was Nixon's lead Secret Service agent. Those were the only four.
Couple seconds. What was the difference, Moscow versus going to Beijing?
Significant. The Chinese, when they tell you something, that's how it'll happen the way they tell you. In Moscow, they lie.
They still do today. All right, we'll be right back. All right, Dwight Chapin, the book, The President's Man, The Memoirs of Nixon's Trusted Aide. And I want to play a little bit of a game now, but because there's so many fascinating figures, I want to give a brief first thing that comes to mind kind of about these folks. The first two I'm going to start off with, because I'm surprised. Haldeman, you had a contentious, little bit more negative relationship than the public would have assumed. They thought this, all you guys were like this. And Kissinger, I was surprised, you had a very good relationship with. Talk briefly about them.
Well, Haldeman was my immediate boss,
yes.
And we kind of had a hate-love relationship, if you will, and from the standpoint I'd worked for him for a number of years. His key attribute was his management skills.
Right.
My key attribute are my creative skills. Yeah. And so...
And you're a people person.
I'm very much a people person. Bob is a more routine, let's get it done type person. So I think it was an element of style controversy there. With Kissinger, I was subservient. Yeah. I treated him with respect, but I got it back the same way. He was easy to deal with. I joked that I have my master's in Kissinger 101.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's nobody ever described him as easy to work with.
Yeah.
The story you tell in the book, where he comes out of his office and Eagleburger is passed out on the floor, and he walks over him to hand the papers to his secretary.
Turns around and walks back into his office, closes the door.
And the guy could have been dead.
Yeah, everybody was poor Larry was laying there on the floor, but everybody else was just in hysterics laughing because it was such a oddball. If you wrote it for a comedy script for a movie, nobody would believe it,
Okay, Ehrlichman now. Now, you remember back before the Watergate Committee, they were both positioned as these just Teutonic, kind of jerks. But they weren't the same, and Ehrlichman has great integrity, right, as you say in your book, which was obviously shredded.
Yeah, well, Ehrlichman has great integrity, but so did Haldeman. And I think the key to what you just said is they were so positioned as these evil guys. You got to keep in mind what came down at Nixon. I mean, we see it. We saw it in the recent administration when the deep state starts pushing. And you had a combination of the deep state back there in 1973 and 1972. I mean, had Nixon not been riding so high, coming out of China, going off to the Russia SALT talks, an election where he won every state except Massachusetts and the District of Columbia, Nixon's riding way up high. And the people that were loyal to Ted Kennedy were trying to figure out how to revive him after Chappaquiddick. And the name of the game was to bring down Richard Nixon. Why was there so much leaking within the bureaucracy of various facts and so forth? Just like they leaked against Trump. I mean, the campaign to get Nixon and to bring him down was substantial.
John Dean, I was surprised that he sat in the FBI interviews of folks like yourself, was representing the president, was trying to represent himself, which was in conflict, right, with that job. He wanted you to pretend to go to Walter Reed to get out of the scene.
Right. You got to realize that one of the things that's in our book that we found as we were doing our research was in 1974. So this is after all of this was taking place. A 1970 report to the director of the FBI. Mm-hmm. And in that report, the FBI identifies John Dean as the master manipulator of Watergate. Those were the exact words. So John Dean was orchestrating all of this in order to save his own skin.
Why did Nixon trust a guy that was so young that he didn't know?
Because he didn't know not to trust him. It's one of these things where he was brought in, and he is, to his detriment, assuming that John Dean is telling him the truth. And John Dean is not telling him the truth. He is not giving him the facts. He doesn't say, Mr. President, I need to tell you that I took G. Gordon Liddy in to meet John Mitchell, 4 months before the Watergate break-in happened, and I think that is important for you to know at the start of it. Then, with that piece of knowledge, Nixon would have probably called Mitchell on the carpet, and he would have probably fired John Dean. But Dean doesn't tell him what the truth is.
John Dean, I interviewed him, and then somebody afterwards sent me an email who was convinced that Dean could be proven to have been deep throat, which he was not. But let me ask you what you think about that. And I guess you will see in the book that Al Haig was rumored to be deep throat before it came out.
Yes. Well, I talked to a gentleman last week who tells me that every piece of information that Mark Felt gave to Bob Woodward can be traced back to John Dean.
Yeah, maybe it's the same guy.
And John Dean is giving this information to Mark Felt. Whichever route you want to follow, it is Mark Felt that's giving the information to Bob Woodward.
One of the things that bothers me the most, because he would be a hero, is Bob Woodward. Positioning Felt as doing this out of moral.
That's completely
absolutely
bull.
Untrue. He was totally upset that he wasn't picked by Nixon and to be the head of the FBI. And the fact that this was not disclosed by Woodward is another major conflict of interest.
Absolutely. There are conflicts all over the place. Bob Haldeman wrote my daughter, Kimberly.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
When she was in high school.
Tell us that right now. I was going to ask the next section what lessons he got out of Watergate.
Yes. Well, Kimberly was doing her junior thesis at New Trier in Chicago, and she wrote Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and Nixon, and they all four wrote back. Jeez. And so she got these letters, and Bob Haldeman made the point to her in his letter that it was going to take decades to get to the bottom of the truth on Watergate. I mean, even today, 50 years later, there are all kinds of questions as to exactly what happened.
My nephews and nieces went to New Trier. That's a great school. Chuck Colson.
Great guy.
Great. See, that surprises me, too. Wasn't his paranoia a lot of underlying this?
Yes.
Feeded Nixon's paranoia?
That was then. This is now.
Oh, okay. Well, we're talking,
we're talking then.
He's a religious conversion.
And he had his conversion, and I at first doubted that conversion. Then I spent time talking with Chuck, and I can guarantee you it was from the heart. It was true, and he really had taken and had a complete revolution of thought.
Did he feel culpable then for the culture?
Oh, he did, and he was very forthcoming on his mistakes and so forth. He was a negative influence in the Nixon White House because
Did you know that at the time, Bob Haldeman?
Yes, I had the responsibility of, along with a couple of others, every time Colson left the president's office, we had to debrief him so that we knew what the hell was going on. And what the main problem there is that he wouldn't stop into our offices to be debriefed, so we would have to track him down to find out what had happened. So it was a constant pull and tug with Chuck.
Did you know Howard Hunt or Gordon Liddy at all?
No, I met Gordon Liddy later, but I did not know either one of them.
How would you talk about Pat Nixon?
She was wonderful. Pat Nixon, when I moved to New York, Nixon, after he got defeated in California, moved back to New York. He wanted to be in the center of all of the activity, of people moving through New York City. Mm-hmm. And I came back a couple of years later and offered to volunteer. I called Rosemary Woods, Nixon's secretary, and offered to go down I was working at J. Walter Thompson in Midtown, and after work would go down to Wall Street and help out answering correspondence. And the person teaching me how to do that was Mrs. Nixon. And it's a very important piece in understanding how I got into the Nixon orbit, because by sitting there evening after evening, keep in mind I'm doing this after work, and Mrs. Nixon teaching me, but she's asking about my daughters, asking about my wife Susie, and getting to know me.
She wasn't Plastic Pat like
She was not. She was a very sophisticated political person. But what happened in there, Jim, is that a trust relationship started building. So I'm sure she said to her husband, Dick,
this guy can be trusted.
this young man is somebody you can trust. And it was out of that I was invited to be Nixon's personal aide, and I traveled with him across the country for a year and a half, just the two of us.
All right, we have a minute to go, the last one, because I've always admired this guy until I thought he screwed up the Iraq War. He was my congressman, I think, for a while, Rumsfeld.
Don Rumsfeld,
yeah.
Great guy. I happen to have a very close relationship with Don. I'm the only person you probably know that helped work and put together his strategic plan to run for president. He was going to run against George Herbert Walker Bush, but then elected not to do so. But we had a full plan put together. Dick Wirthlin was our pollster. We were on the track.
Each other? Bush 41 and Rumsfeld?
Bush and Don Rumsfeld did not have a good relationship. Don Rumsfeld came from a middle-income family. Bush came with his silver spoon in his mouth from Greenwich. George Bush was a great guy. I am not putting down George Bush at all.
Yes.
He was a wonderful human being. But Don also was quite a distinguished man himself.
Okay, back for our final national segment. Dwight Chapin, he was deputy assistant to Richard Nixon, caught up in Watergate. One of the things that interests me is, how did you stay so loyal? I mean, here it is. Nixon and Dean at one point talked about making you a fall guy when they knew you were not uninvolved. You went to prison. You had your whole life blown up, and you're completely loyal.
Yes. Yes, I am. And I got to say, Jim, I'm proud of that. I was given an experience that few young men are ever given. As I say in my book, The President's Man, I just wish there hadn't been a price tag called Watergate. Take that away, and I was given one of the great privileges of all time to serve a president of the United States, to work with Henry Kissinger and the president on the trip to China, to do the trip to Moscow, and to be involved in so many different presidential initiatives. So and this all happened to me when I was a very young man. So I've reaped the benefit of this all through life, although I've had to deal with the consequence of the leveling aspect of Watergate. I mean, that cut against my reputation. Mm-hmm. And so I had to work with people so that they understood what I was all about. Mm-hmm. But once they got to understand what I was all about, then they trusted me and started realizing maybe why the President of the United States had trusted me, and so forth.
Do you have remorse for anything you did? I know you feel that you were wrongly treated by this.
I do.
You shouldn't have gone to jail, but do you have remorse? Did you make mistakes?
I would still be sitting in prison, probably, had I not written a letter of contrition to Judge Gazelle. I refused to do it for months, but I wasn't getting out of prison. And my lawyer said, Dwight, if you don't write that letter, you're able to sit there forever. So I wrote.
Sincere, though, in what you wrote?
I wrote a letter. Here's where I was sincere. Okay. I was not sincere by saying what I had done was wrong, but I did say that I must have done something wrong or I wouldn't have been here. So it was a matter of degrees of admission. I feel bad about it because from the standpoint that, it was not a, come to Jesus moment where I said, I was a horrible sinner and so forth. But I made a mistake or I wouldn't have been there.
All right. What was your relationship with Nixon post-Watergate, after he's out of office and you're out of prison?
After I got out of prison, I took my wife and our girls, who by that time probably were 11 and 8. We went to San Clemente and to visit him, to say hello. We were on a trip to Southern California. And the thing that stuck in my mind is he had us come into his office, and he kind of fumbled around. He was kind of awkward when it came to this kind of stuff. Yeah. But then all of a sudden, there was kind of a click, and knew he was moving into what he really wanted to do. And he looked at both of my daughters and he said, I want you to know that your father made a great contribution to the country. And that to me was
very nice, yeah.
one of the great things that had happened. I saw him in New Jersey a few times. We would see each other at various reunion events.
Did he apologize to you ever?
He never. That's not him. He didn't apologize. No,
Yeah.
but I was in Lompoc prison in February of 1976, and I got a letter from him saying, Dwight, Mrs. Nixon and I are going to China in a couple of weeks, and I just want you to know that I was remembering our trip and everything that you did.
Yeah, that is nice.
So that told me I was on his mind. But he wasn't the kind of guy that came out and said, I'm really sorry what happened to you.
I'll always remember that at Nixon's final speech, you'll remember, to the staff in the White House, he's got glasses on, which he never did. But he ends up saying, always remember, don't hate or you destroy yourself. He engendered that culture. And I'm talking about his insecurity, his conspiracy thinking, and the fact that he realized afterwards that just pure hate wasn't effective.
Yeah, let me flip that for you. Did he realize it because that had been what had been put on to him?
Yes, oh yeah.
Or did he put it on? And I maintain that it was how he was treated that led him to be pushing back more so than that was his natural instincts to push. He was a man that was in this for service. Mm-hmm. He was a man that and we go back to the idea of the statesman side of things at the outset of our conversation. So I believe that a lot of the resentments, and let's call it resentments, that Nixon harbored came from how he personally was treated.
Now, a lot of these problems emanated from campaign money, and Creep had money like all over the place, right? Does that still bother you, money in politics?
Yes, I think that's one of the great problems. I mean, we particularly these congressmen and senators and so forth that used to get elected and move to Washington and take their families.
Talk to each other.
And talk to each other and take their families. Now they don't even take their families because they have to go home every weekend. They have to. Their full-time job is not representing the American public. Their full-time job is raising funds for their next election.
How have you, as we finish up, how has this book affected you going through and doing this, and your kids?
I had both my daughters read the book when it was in a manuscript form, and they made some suggestions and so forth. It has been, for me, very lethargic. I mean, it's been good, cathartic. I want to say, and I feel very good about it. I feel like I am able to explain more about Richard Nixon and what he was like as a human being, and so the book is doing very well. It's very successful, and I'm very grateful for all that. And I hold in my heart a lot of gratitude that at 81 I was able to put this forward.
It's a great contribution, and there's endless fascination with Nixon. And, and I find much more respect that I have than when I was in college. When you realize that the presidents since, none of them have had the strategic, almost statesman mindset that this guy had.
Yes. I was just listening on the radio coming in here, and they were talking about the alliance that's building between Russia and China on the Ukraine matter. And I was thinking, if Nixon were alive, he would be taking that apart and interjecting us in there and strategically
Third-dimensional chess, you called it in the book. Thanks to Dwight Chapin, The President's Man, the memoirs of Nixon's trusted aide. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. You can go to our YouTube station as well as radio stations, Jim Campbell Radio. And please check into my book, Madoff Talks, Uncovering the Untold Story of the Most Notorious Ponzi Scheme in History, from McGraw-Hill, being made into a documentary by Netflix. Thanks to our national audience for listening. We'll see everybody on the next edition of Business Talk with Jim Campbell.
Would you like to host your own radio program or podcast? Park City Productions 06604 is a Bridgeport, Connecticut-based radio broadcast solutions company. Follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's Park City Productions 06604. Call us at 203-522-8801.